My name is Calvin Rhodes, and 3 months ago, I watched my supervisor destroy what he thought was nothing but outdated relationship files and meeting notes. He stood behind my workstation, announced to our entire department that my year of effort was worthless garbage, then pressed delete while 26 people stared. What he actually erased was the foundation holding our company together. And when my phone rang a couple minutes later with a $145,000 job offer, I realized he had just screwed himself over in the most spectacular way possible. Before I tell you exactly how watching him panic became the sweetest moment of my professional life, let me take you back to where this really started, because revenge stories always begin long before the actual revenge happens. I'm 47 years old, and I've been in this business for 24 years. Started right out of college when I was 23, worked my way up through 3 different firms before landing at Hartwell Analytics in Chicago. I joined them as a senior account coordinator 20 months ago. The job description made it sound routine enough: maintain client relationships, manage contract renewals, track satisfaction metrics. What they didn't mention was that the company was bleeding major accounts faster than anyone wanted to admit. And the previous guy in my position had lasted exactly 6 months before walking out without notice. My supervisor, Preston Wallace, made it clear from day one that he considered my approach completely outdated. He was one of those 31-year-old MBA types from Northwestern who believed business relationships were purely about data and metrics. Send reports, deliver analysis, collect payments, optimize efficiency. The idea that clients might actually want to talk to real people was completely foreign to his systematic approach to everything. But I saw something different in those first few weeks. When I reviewed our client files, I found page after page of sterile communication logs that read like they were written by robots. No personality, no warmth, no indication that anyone at our company had ever bothered to learn anything personal about the executives who were sending us hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. So I started doing something that seemed revolutionary in that environment. I began treating our clients like actual human beings with lives outside their spreadsheets. When Arthur Kellerman, who ran a mid-sized steel fabrication company, mentioned during a routine quarterly review that he was restoring a 1967 Mustang Fastback, I made a note. 2 weeks later, I followed up asking how the engine work was progressing. You should have seen how surprised he was that someone actually remembered. He spent half an hour telling me about finding original parts and his weekend trips to car shows. When Patricia Sinclair celebrated her industrial equipment company's 20th anniversary, I sent a personalized message acknowledging the milestone and asking about her expansion plans. She ended up scheduling an additional consultation that brought in $65,000 of unexpected revenue just because someone took the time to remember her business meant something to her. These weren't expensive gestures or elaborate gifts. I simply listened when people shared pieces of their lives, remembered what mattered to them, and followed up in ways that showed I actually cared about their success beyond what they paid us. Preston never understood what I was doing. He would walk past my workstation and see me typing what looked like personal conversation notes, and I could practically feel the disapproval radiating off him. During our monthly reviews, he would flip through my activity reports with this frustrated expression. "Why are you spending 90 minutes on calls that should take 30?" he would ask, tapping his pen against his tablet like he was keeping score. "Efficiency metrics show you're processing fewer interactions per hour than optimal." I tried explaining that longer conversations were building stronger relationships, that clients were specifically requesting to work with me on new projects, that our retention rate had improved by 43% since I started personalizing our approach. But Preston only cared about numbers that fit into his dashboard formulas. What he didn't realize was that I was building something far more valuable than efficient call logs. I was becoming the bridge between our company and the people who actually kept us in business. Howard Brennan, who owned a chain of manufacturing facilities, started calling me directly when he needed anything instead of going through our main number. He told me flat out that he appreciated talking to someone who remembered he was passionate about vintage motorcycles and that his son was studying engineering at Purdue. Stephanie Walsh, whose logistics company was our second largest monthly revenue source, began recommending our services to other companies specifically because she enjoyed our conversations about her weekend fishing trips and her plans for early retirement. Month after month, I watched our client satisfaction scores climb while Preston remained laser-focused on efficiency metrics that completely missed the point. He was measuring how quickly we could process interactions while I was building the loyalty that would determine whether those interactions continued happening at all. The breaking point came during our annual strategic planning meeting. Our CEO, Gerald Hoffman, was reviewing department performance when he mentioned that client retention had reached an all-time high. He specifically praised our relationship management approach and suggested expanding the personal touch strategy across other departments. I watched Preston's face change as the credit for improved retention landed squarely on what he considered my inefficient methods. After the meeting ended, he cornered me near the elevator bank. "I don't know what kind of social hour you're running," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation. "But this company succeeds on professional excellence, not casual conversations about hobbies and personal interests." That's when he assigned me to complete a comprehensive analysis of all client interactions over the past 18 months. He wanted detailed documentation of every communication, every follow-up note, every relationship-building effort I had made. It was clearly intended as punishment. Hundreds of hours of bureaucratic busy work that would pull me away from the actual relationship building that was driving our success. But I approached the analysis project with the same attention to detail that I brought to everything else. I created comprehensive records showing not just what communications had occurred, but how those communications had translated into real business outcomes. I documented the referrals that Howard had generated, the expanded services that Arthur had purchased after we discussed his company's growth plans, the early contract renewal that Patricia had signed because she trusted our partnership. The finished analysis was 18 pages of solid proof that personal attention to client relationships was directly responsible for over $850,000 in additional revenue. Every casual conversation about weekend projects or family updates had strengthened business ties that our competitors couldn't replicate with their generic professional approach. I was proud of that analysis. It represented not just 18 months of work, but 18 months of genuine connections that had transformed how our company related to the people who trusted us with their business, which made what happened next feel like such a slap in the face. Preston called an all-hands department meeting on a Tuesday morning in late October. He announced that we needed to review our client relationship protocols and that my analysis would serve as a case study for discussion. I figured he was finally ready to acknowledge that personal attention was driving our improved performance. Boy, was I wrong. Instead, he directed me to display my analysis files on the main conference room screen while the entire department watched. Then he began picking apart every personal note, every conversation detail, every relationship-building effort as evidence of what he called unprofessional boundary violations. "This is exactly the kind of inefficiency that undermines our service standards," he declared, scrolling through months of careful documentation. "Personal chit-chat about cars and hobbies has no place in business communications. These files represent a complete failure to maintain appropriate professional distance." I sat there watching 26 coworkers as he tore apart work that had generated nearly $1 million in revenue for our company. He was presenting my biggest professional accomplishment as a cautionary tale about what not to do. But then he did something that crossed a line I never expected him to cross. He pulled up the file containing my complete analysis database, every client note, every relationship detail, every conversation record that proved how personal attention was driving our business success. His cursor moved toward the delete option while he continued talking about the need for professional standards. "This entire approach is garbage," he announced, his hand hovering over the deletion command. "Starting today, we return to efficient professional client communication protocols." And then he clicked delete. I watched 18 months of relationship building disappear from the screen. 18 pages of documented connections that had generated over $850,000 in revenue, gone in one vindictive moment. Nobody said a word. You could hear a pin drop. Preston turned away from the screen with this satisfied expression, clearly expecting me to accept this humiliation and start rebuilding my work according to his preferred methods. But he had made one huge miscalculation. While he was destroying my documentation, he hadn't destroyed the actual relationships I had built. The clients who trusted me, who called me directly, who had shared personal details about their lives and businesses. Those connections existed in their minds and hearts, not in our computer files. And apparently some of those connections had been paying closer attention to our company dynamics than anyone realized. My phone started buzzing before Preston had finished explaining his new efficiency protocols. The caller ID showed Donovan Partners, a consulting firm that had recently formed when 4 former colleagues left their previous company to start their own operation. I stepped out of the conference room to take the call. My hands were still shaking from watching my work get deleted in front of everyone. "Calvin," said the voice on the other end, "we've been watching what's happening at Hartwell and we want to talk." The conversation that followed would change everything. Donovan Partners had been tracking our client retention improvements, and they knew exactly who was responsible for the relationships that kept major accounts happy. They had been planning to approach me for months, but watching Preston destroy my analysis files had convinced them that the timing was perfect. "We're prepared to offer you $145,000 annually to join our team," they said. "Plus, equity participation and complete autonomy over client relationship strategies. We believe personal attention is the future of business consulting, and we want you to build that future with us." $145,000, a 53% increase over my current compensation, working for people who valued exactly what Preston considered worthless inefficiency. But the most beautiful part of their offer wasn't even the money. "We know you can't bring proprietary information from Hartwell," they continued. "But we also know that client relationships are built on trust and personal connection, not on database files. If you choose to join us, and if clients choose to work with someone they trust rather than staying with someone who treats them like account numbers, that's simply the natural consequence of different business philosophies." I understood immediately what they were getting at. They weren't asking me to steal clients or violate any legal agreements. They were simply pointing out that if I left Hartwell and clients decided they preferred working with someone who remembered their restoration projects and their kids' college plans, that was their choice to make. When I walked back into the conference room, Preston was still lecturing about professional efficiency standards while my former co-workers stared at their hands or notebooks, clearly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. He noticed my return and paused his presentation. "Do you have questions about our new communication protocols?" I looked around the room at people I had worked alongside for 20 months, then at the blank screen where my analysis had been displayed before being destroyed, then back at Preston's expectant expression. "Actually," I said, "I have something to announce. What happened next would become the most satisfying moment of my professional life. I'm resigning from Hartwell Analytics effective immediately," I said, keeping my voice steady despite everything that had just happened. "I'll be joining Donovan Partners as their Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships." The conference room went completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the background and someone's pen clicking nervously against their notepad. Preston's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion, then to something that looked almost like panic. "You can't just quit in the middle of a department meeting," he stammered, clearly thrown off by this unexpected development. "There are protocols, notice requirements, transition procedures." "Actually," I replied, pulling out my phone to show the contract offer I had just received, "my employment agreement allows for immediate resignation in cases of hostile work environment or professional misconduct. Having my work deleted in front of colleagues while being publicly humiliated qualifies on both counts." Gerald Hoffman, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately before making any hasty decisions." But I was done with private discussions and diplomatic solutions. Preston had chosen to humiliate me publicly so he would get to experience the consequences just as publicly. "There's nothing to discuss," I said, gathering my personal items from the conference table. "My decision is final. I'll submit formal resignation paperwork within the hour." As I walked toward the conference room exit, I could feel 26 pairs of eyes following my movement. Some of my coworkers looked shocked, others looked impressed, and a few looked like they were seriously reconsidering their own career choices. Preston called after me, his voice higher than usual. "You're making a huge mistake. Donovan Partners is a startup with no proven track record. You're throwing away job security for some fantasy about relationship building being more important than professional standards." I paused at the doorway and turned back to face him. "We'll see which approach proves more valuable." Within 24 hours, I had cleaned out my office, completed exit interviews, and started my new position at Donovan Partners. Their office was smaller than Hartwell's, but it was filled with energy and excitement about building something innovative in the consulting space. More importantly, I was finally working with people who understood that business relationships were built on genuine human connection, not efficiency metrics and standardized communication protocols. But the real validation of my decision came in the weeks that followed as I sat back and watched it all fall apart exactly like you'd expect. I hadn't reached out to any Hartwell clients. I hadn't made sales calls or sent recruitment messages. I simply updated my professional profiles to reflect my new position and continued being the same person who had spent 18 months building authentic relationships with people who needed consulting services. The first call came on Thursday morning, 3 days after I started at Donovan Partners. Arthur Kellerman, the manufacturing company owner whose Mustang restoration I had followed, called my new office number directly. "Calvin," he said, "I heard through the professional network that you've moved to a new firm. I wanted to congratulate you and ask about your new company's capabilities." We talked for an hour and a half about his business needs, his expansion plans, and yes, his car's new transmission work. By the end of the conversation, he had scheduled a consultation meeting to discuss transitioning his account to Donovan Partners. The second call came that same afternoon. Patricia Sinclair, whose company anniversary I had celebrated, wanted to discuss her upcoming project needs with someone who understood her business philosophy. "I've been working with consulting firms for 15 years, she told me, "and you're the first person who ever made me feel like my company mattered beyond the invoice amount. If you're offering the same personal attention at your new firm, I'm interested in making a change." By the end of my first week at Donovan Partners, I had received calls from 7 former Hartwell clients, not because I had solicited them, but because they preferred working with someone who treated them as individuals rather than account numbers. Meanwhile, back at Hartwell Analytics, Preston was starting to realize what he had actually deleted when he destroyed my relationship-building documentation. I heard about his growing panic through mutual connections in the professional community. Apparently, he had tried to reach out to major clients for routine check-ins, only to discover that many of them were no longer interested in continuing their contracts. When he called Arthur to schedule his quarterly review, Arthur politely informed him that he was exploring other consulting options and would not be renewing his annual agreement. When he contacted Patricia about upcoming project needs, Patricia explained that she had found a consulting partner who better understood her business values. One by one, the clients I had spent 18 months building relationships with were making the choice to work with someone who remembered their personal interests, their business challenges, and their individual communication preferences. Preston had believed that client loyalty was tied to Hartwell's brand reputation and service quality. Turns out he was dead wrong about that. Client loyalty was actually tied to the personal connections that made people feel valued and understood. Howard Brennan, the manufacturing facilities owner who had always called me directly, didn't even bother with a formal explanation. He simply stopped returning Preston's calls and had his assistant redirect all communication requests to my new number at Donovan Partners. Stephanie Walsh, whose logistics company was such a major revenue source, was more direct. According to someone who was still working at Hartwell, she had told Preston flat out that she was following me to Donovan Partners because she valued working with someone who understood that business relationships weren't just about spreadsheets and efficiency metrics. By the end of my first month at Donovan Partners, 9 former Hartwell clients had either switched to our firm or initiated conversations about potential transitions. These weren't small accounts either. They represented over 60% of Hartwell's annual revenue. I wasn't actively recruiting them. I was simply being available when they called, remembering details about their lives and businesses, and providing the same personal attention that had built our relationships in the first place. Donovan Partners was growing faster than their most optimistic projections, while Hartwell Analytics was experiencing what you could only describe as a complete meltdown. The most satisfying part wasn't the money or the professional success, though both were incredible. The most satisfying part was knowing that Preston had created this entire situation himself through his stubborn refusal to value what clients actually wanted. He could have supported my relationship-building approach. He could have learned from the improved retention rates and client satisfaction scores. He could have recognized that personal attention was generating measurable business results. Instead, he had chosen to publicly humiliate me and delete work that represented nearly $1 million in client loyalty, apparently believing that his efficiency-focused philosophy was more important than actual evidence of what worked. 2 months after my departure, I heard through professional networks that Gerald Hoffman had called an emergency board meeting to address what they were calling a client retention crisis. Hartwell Analytics was facing the possibility of major layoffs, reduced operations, and potentially merging with a larger firm just to survive the revenue loss. Preston, who had been so confident about his professional standards and efficiency metrics, was now scrambling to explain how the company had lost most of its major accounts within 8 weeks of my departure. According to sources who were still working there, he had initially tried to blame my departure for the client defections, arguing that I had somehow violated ethical standards or poisoned client relationships to steal accounts. But the timeline didn't support his accusations at all. Clients weren't leaving immediately after I resigned. They were leaving after attempting to maintain relationships with Preston's new efficiency-focused approach, and discovering that they much preferred working with people who treated them as individuals rather than account numbers. The board investigation revealed exactly what I could have told them months earlier. Clients choose consulting partners based on trust, communication quality, and feeling valued, not on how quickly their calls get processed or how efficiently their concerns get categorized into spreadsheet cells. Preston had spent 18 months dismissing relationship building as inefficient social hour conversation, and now he was facing the consequences of that philosophy in the form of client defections that threatened the entire company's survival. 3 months after my departure, I received the call that made this whole story complete. Gerald Hoffman contacted me personally to discuss what he called a potential partnership opportunity. He wanted to know if Donovan Partners would be interested in acquiring Hartwell's remaining client accounts and possibly hiring some of their staff during what he described as a strategic restructuring process. The company that had considered my relationship-building approach inefficient garbage was now hoping to sell their remaining assets to the firm that had been built on exactly the principles Preston had rejected. During our conversation, Gerald mentioned that they were also reevaluating leadership approaches in their client relations department. Reading between the lines, it was pretty clear that Preston's position was no longer secure. "I have to ask," Gerald said toward the end of our call, "what would it take to bring you back to Hartwell as Director of Client Relations? We're prepared to offer significant compensation increases and complete autonomy over relationship management strategies." The irony was incredible. 3 months after watching my work get deleted in front of my colleagues, I was being recruited back to implement exactly the same approach at a much higher salary with complete authority over the department that had rejected my methods. But I had no interest in returning to work for people who had only learned to value my approach after losing millions of dollars in revenue. "I appreciate the offer," I told him, "but I'm very happy with my current position." Donovan Partners understood the value of personal client relationships from day one rather than having to learn it through crisis. 6 months after leaving Hartwell Analytics, I was promoted to partner at Donovan Partners with equity participation and responsibility for expanding our client relationship philosophy across multiple service lines. The clients who had followed me from Hartwell became the foundation for our most successful year in company history. Meanwhile, Hartwell Analytics underwent the strategic restructuring that Gerald had mentioned. They laid off 35% of their staff, sold their prime downtown office space, and ultimately merged with a competitor who valued efficiency metrics over personal relationships. Preston was not retained during the merger. I learned about his departure through LinkedIn updates and professional network conversations. According to former colleagues, he had spent his final months at Hartwell trying to rebuild client relationships using the same impersonal approach that had caused the crisis in the first place. He apparently never understood that the problem wasn't his communication skills or technical knowledge. The problem was his fundamental belief that business relationships should be purely transactional. The last update I heard about his situation came from a mutual professional contact who mentioned that he was having difficulty finding comparable positions because his most recent role had ended during a major client retention crisis. Potential employers were understandably concerned about hiring someone whose management approach had contributed to such significant revenue loss, especially for client-facing roles where relationship building was considered essential. Looking back, Preston did me the biggest favor of my career when he deleted those files. He forced me into a situation where I had to prove the value of everything I believed about business relationships, and it turned out I was absolutely right. Sometimes the best thing that can happen is having someone show you exactly who they really are and what they really think of your work. It gives you perfect clarity about whether you're in the right place or if it's time to move on to somewhere that actually values what you bring to the table. If you've ever had a boss delete your work or publicly dismiss your contributions, you know exactly how that moment felt. The anger, the disbelief, the feeling like you've been punched in the gut. But here's what I learned. Sometimes that's exactly the push you need to realize you're capable of much more than your current situation allows. Preston thought he was deleting inefficient documentation when he destroyed my relationship-building work. What he actually deleted was the only thing preventing his professional world from collapsing around him. And you know what? That's exactly what he deserved. This most satisfying revenge isn't elaborate schemes or calculated attacks. It's simply letting people experience the natural consequences of their own terrible decisions while you go build something better somewhere else. 24 years in this business taught me that relationships matter more than metrics. People matter more than processes. And sometimes the most professional thing you can do is walk away from people who don't understand that. Best decision I ever made.